Hello, and welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory. So, if you grew up anywhere near a radio, a wedding dance floor, or a 1980s movie montage, you've heard the Pointer Sisters. I'm so excited, Jump for My Love, Neutron Dance. Their songs feel joyful and effortless, but the story behind them is anything but simple. The Pointer Sisters crossed lines that most artists never touched from jazz to country, R&B to pop, swing to MTV, and they did it while staying unmistakably themselves. So yes, of course, we're talking about who they were, how they started, and why their music still works decades later. You know, they're not my favorite group of all time or anything like that, but it's hard to not like the song I'm so excited, you know. If nothing else, there's like a nostalgia factor for me if I ever hear that song nowadays. It's just undeniably a 1980s track, right? So the Pointer Sisters came from Oakland, California. They were four actual sisters, so it's not just a stage name. You had Ruth Pointer, Anita Pointer, Bonnie Pointer, and June Pointer. They were raised in a strict household. Their parents were ministers, and music in the house was mostly gospel. There was no pop radio, no blues records, no jazz clubs, or anything like that. Ruth later said they didn't even know who the Andrews sisters were, so they weren't chasing nostalgia. They didn't have anyone to copy. So that turned out to be a strange advantage in a way. And for the early years, the group's earliest version formed in 1969 when June and Bonnie performed as a duo called Pointers Au Pair. Anita joined soon after, and Ruth came in by the end of 1972. This was the early 1970s. At that time, rock was louder, soul was political, funk was seemingly taking over, and of course, you also had disco, which they actually did end up incorporating elements from it. In fact, they incorporated elements from a lot of different things. And, you also still had, jazz that was a pretty big influence on them, too, from what I gather. And the Pointer Sisters walked out wearing 1940s style outfits when they started. They sang tight harmonies, swing rhythms. They apparently had jazz phrasing. I admit I haven't listened to their earlier stuff that much. But it's something that looked completely out of step with the moment at the time. A lot of people didn't know how to react to them, what to do with them, and so they weren't an immediate breakout success. Their first record deal produced very little attention, but when they signed with Blue Thumb Records, things changed, and they seemed to change pretty quickly actually. So Blue Thumb Records, it's like they had the thumb on the pulse of, something big. Their self-titled debut album came out in 1973 and caught critics' attention right away. People noticed how versatile they were. Jazz 1 minute, R&B the next, that sort of thing. Their breakout song was Yes We Can, written by Alan Toussaint. It hit number 2 or no, number 11. Sorry, I was reading the two like Roman numerals here, but they reached number 11 on the pop chart, and it became their first real hit. Then came something no one expected. There was a song called "Fairy Tale" in 1974, written by Anita and Bonnie. It was actually a country song, so it wasn't just country influenced, it wasn't just a crossover. It's pretty much just straight up country if you listen to the track. And I did listen to it because I was curious about what that sounded like. And it sure is different from plenty of their other songs. They won a Grammy for it, becoming the first black female group to win a Grammy in a country category. They also became the first African American female singers to perform at the Grand Ole Opry. I didn't know that going into this research for this episode, but they were trailblazers in that respect as well. And that's something that matters, and maybe it matters a lot even. I I I didn't know that. It really changed how I perceived the Pointer Sisters. It proved they weren't just a one-hit wonder novelty. They weren't just dabbling. They could walk into any genre and seem to belong there. I, I granted I don't think there's going to be a Pointer Sisters death metal album or something like that. I think that premise can only be stretched so far, but I think you get the point. Shortly after that hit, Bonnie Pointer left the group to pursue a solo career. The remaining sisters, Ruth, Anita, and June, made a decision that would define the rest of their run. They essentially changed their sound to more pop, R&B, and they became part of what you might call the 80s machine. As a trio, the Pointer Sisters leaned into pop, R&B, dance, and a little bit of rock even, And the harmonies stayed tight, but the production got sharper, brighter, and built for radio. And it worked pretty well, you know. A lot of people have heard their songs from the 80s. In 1978, they scored a massive hit with Fire, written by Bruce Springsteen. It climbed all the way to number two on the pop charts and introduced them to a much wider audience. The real peak came in 1983 with the album Breakout. It went triple platinum. It had hit after hit. You had Automatic, Jump for My Love, I'm So Excited, and Neutron Dance, which became inseparable from Beverly Hills Cop. Now, I'm So Excited is the song that I best know them for, and it's the one that I have the most nostalgic feelings for because I'm sure that I heard that on MTV and on the radio back then. So they won Grammys, they dominated MTV, they were on movie soundtracks, award shows, and radio nonstop. So at their height, the Pointer Sisters weren't merely successful, they were basically unavoidable. They mattered a lot back in the day. A lot of groups had hits in the 80s, of course, but very few had the range that the Pointer Sisters did stylistically. They could sing jazz without sounding stiff, they could do pop without losing their soulful touch, and they could sing country without being treated as outsiders, which again, I was surprised to learn because I didn't know that before I looked into it. And that kind of credibility is actually sort of rare. Their songs weren't complicated, but they were smart, built on strong melodies, driven by energy, anchored by voices that locked together perfectly. And when you hear I'm So Excited, it still works because it was never trying to be trendy. It was just trying to feel good, and it does. So sure, we could link it to the 1980s era and all that. It does have that sound, but it does kind of transcend that 1980s sound at the same time because it's just, sort of upbeat and positive. And even though that's even though that's not the normal kind of stuff that I listen to, I'm more mopey in my own musical tastes and preferences, but I do like I'm So Excited. I mean, who doesn't like that song? I guess if you're well, if you're just a certain way, you won't like it, but a lot of us, we sort of carve out a spot and allow I'm So Excited to, I guess, just make us excited, you know? And by the early 1990s, the group faded from the spotlight, as tends to happen after a while. Each sister tried solo projects, but none matched what they had together. June Pointer passed away in 2006. Anita, but like I'm British now all of a sudden. Anita Pointer died in 2022, so just a few years back. Ruth Pointer has continued performing with later versions of the group, I think she's kept the sister theme, at least, or the family theme, I should say. And, it's been keeping the name and the music alive. I don't know if they're ever going to have any hits again, but, they're still out there performing. And the songs never left, which, of course, is the most important thing. They're still played at weddings, at parties, on old school radio, in movies and commercials, and all that kind of stuff. So that instant lift you feel when the chorus hits is the Pointer Sisters doing exactly what they have done best. They crossed genres, they erased borders, and they even have somebody like me out there sometimes feeling nostalgia for what their music provides. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. So, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, if you're one of those few who actually does, follow the show and share it with someone who still knows every word to Jump for Your Love. Not to be confused with the Van Halen song, by the way, of course. So, all right. Have a good night or a good morning, whatever time of day it is.